Okay, so imagine this as a father. So we use father as a generic word, right? Everybody has a father, so there's a generic aspect to it. There's a role that you play if you're a father, and then you could imagine there's a role you could play as a good father. And if you're a good father, you're radically encouraging, and you encourage your children to go out into the world and prevail. You teach them to handle serpents. You don't protect them. You don't shelter them. You push them out and you say, no matter what comes your way, kid, I've got confidence that you can handle it. No matter how terrible it is, no matter how challenging or daunting or malevolent it is, you've got it. And when you see your children doing that, if you're a good father, it fills you with what? It fills you with gratitude and love to see your children acting that out, even at an early age, to taking the risks of their first steps or climbing their first play structure or going out in the playground to make new friends when they're strangers or going off to school alone. All of that, you think, it's dangerous out there. It's like, good, go. I know you can handle it. Okay, so that's what Abraham plays out. He plays out that archetypal role. And the idea there, and this is why I made reference earlier to the idea of the selfish gene. Dawkins characterized human reproduction as selfish. That's wrong, because the human reproductive pattern is multi-generational. And if you want to establish the pattern of fatherhood that's going to cascade down the generations, that will make your descendants successful in the multi-generational manner, then you follow the spirit of adventure and you imbue your children with that confidence. And that's how that pattern that establishes the dynasty, so Abraham is the father of nations, is established. So human reproduction is way more complex than just sex. Far more complex. It's a multi-generational commitment. So now the promise that God makes to Abraham in part is that if you fall into that pattern of maximal adventure and courageous movement forward, that your life is imbued with a meaning that transcends time, and that you embody something like an archetypal and eternal spirit. And that's the spirit of the Father. That's why Abraham understands that he's made contact with the God of his ancestors. And if you're a good father, you have that spirit dwelling within you. And the Christian insistence is that that spirit's identical to the logos that bears the weight of the world on its shoulders voluntarily. And that's what brings everything into being. Stunning. It's a stunning conceptualization. And I think it's right. It looks right to me. And the idea that sacrifice is the basis of the community, that's just obvious. Like the fact that you're married. So what's the sacrificial gesture there? Well, all other women. That's sacrifice number one. Then it's not about you. It's also not about your wife. It's about the stability of your union across time. And it's about the stability of that union insofar as that's a reliable foundation for your children. So that's sacrificial too. You give up your whims in the present so that the future's stabilized. You give up your immaturity so that your children can thrive. That's all sacrificial gesture. And we figured that out. That's why we put the crucifix at the center of our society. Because we figured out, even though we didn't know it, we figured out that the stability of the community is predicated on the willingness of the individual to sacrifice. And the exploration in the New Testament is the limits of sacrifice, right?
So do you think that that's what people think of when they think of the cross?
It's very hard to think about. It's very hard to know what people think about. I would say it depends on their level of sophistication.
Right, that's what I'm getting at. Yeah. I don't think it's ever been explained to me that way, and I don't think most people think about it that way. When they think about it, they think Jesus died for our sins. There he is. Praise Jesus.
Right.
It's a very
formulaic,
surface level understanding.
Well, I think
of what
it's
it is
partly because it's partly, and there's a merciful element of it. And this is what Jung was referring to when he said that religion helps protect people against religious experience. The full revelation of the significance, let's say, of the imitation of Christ, which is supposed to be the foundation of Christian belief, is in fact the demand that you walk the same pathway. And that's it's the most terrifying demand, because so Jung described the Christian passion as an archetypal tragedy. Now, there was a reason for that. So think about it this way. Think about it technically. So imagine that 100 great storytellers told the most painful possible story. And then imagine that you aggregated all those stories and you distilled them into one story where all the terrible elements were present. Okay, so now you have a representation. You have a representation of the worst life can throw at you. Okay, so let's take that apart a bit. So the first thing that makes a tragedy tragic is that the tragedy befalls a good person. Because if a tragedy befalls a villain, it's just justice. It's not a tragedy. So it has to be a good person. So then to amplify that, you would not only have the tragedy befall a good person, you'd have it befall a good person that everyone knew was good, but was not only good, was the best, and that was persecuted because he was good. So that sort of limits it out in that direction. And then you might say, well, what does he have to face? Well, and the answer would be, well, the worst life has to offer. Okay, early death, early painful death, early painful, humiliating, unjust death at the hands of his friends, at the hands of the mob, under the thumb of a tyrant. Right. Brought about by people who knew that he was not only good, but the best of men. That's an archetypal tragedy. And then it doesn't limit out. So then you have the death that occurs in consequence of that, and it's voluntary acceptance. But that's not where it ends, because the mythology surrounding the crucifixion story insists that Christ harrowed hell after the crucifixion, which meant that he confronted not only death, but malevolence itself, and in consequence transcended both. And so what's the underlying psychological message? It's something like the calling and the voice of conscience informing people that in order to thrive properly in life and to become who you could be, if you could be everything you could be, you have to voluntarily take on the weight of the worst life has to offer, including the depths of malevolence itself. And you think, well, obviously, Joe, you know this. Like, how are you going to adapt to a situation you won't even admit to?
Right.
Well, so how could it be otherwise than for you to become everything that you could be, you have to embrace all of the catastrophes that life has to offer? Like, how could it be other than that? You're going to hide? You're going to pretend?
Right.
How's that going to work? No one thinks that'll work.
Right.
And so, and you're right, there is this defensive element to the, particularly the Protestant religious tradition, although I don't want to single out the Protestants specifically, that insists that, you know, the work has already been done. But there's a lot of ambivalence about that in the Christian canon, because there's an equal insistence that, no, you're supposed to take all this on voluntarily.